everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar Culture versus Engagement, which is the Better Performance Lever. My name is Nicole Spiller. I'm a Senior Consultant at Kerr Group and I will be your host for today's session. The topic we're discussing today has sparked a lot of interest amongst many of you, and we are keen to share our insights around this issue. But before we begin, I'd like to just go over a few housekeeping items just to make sure you get the most out of the webinar. In terms of the actual presentation, it will go for 40 minutes, after which we will engage in a Q&A session. There is a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen which you can use to send in your questions. Please send in your questions throughout the presentation rather than waiting until the end, as this gives us an opportunity to collate the questions and make the most of the Q&A session. While we'll do our best to address your questions, we apologise in advance if time does not allow for it. We will, however, make every effort to follow up with you after the webinar. In addition, we'll be providing you with today's slides after the webinar should you wish to share them with others. The link to the webinar recording will also be made available on our website and we'll also send that out to you. Okay, to give you just a little bit of a background about us at Kerr Group. So we might actually change the slides for you as well as we go through. We're a business improvement consulting firm with expertise in people, culture and change and a focus on enabling people strategy. We've just put up our service framework there just to show you where today's topic fits in terms of the areas in which we work. There are 3 key service areas you can see there, and the first one is Inform, which is about clarifying business challenges throughout diagnostic activities such as assessment, strategic facilitation, functional reviews and workforce planning. Create, the middle circle, is about aligning people to strategy, and it includes areas of work such as organisational design, performance culture, which is the focus of our discussion today, people strategy and talent and capability work. The final circle is Activate. It's about enabling disciplined execution, and the areas of work there include program setup, project management, change management and team effectiveness work. So to get us started, I would like to introduce Flavell and Justine Roche, who will lead our discussion today. Both Dylan and Justine are directors of Kerr Group and are registered organisational psychologists. Both have had broad experience working in both internal and consulting roles across a broad range of industry sectors, including not-for-profit and government, and their experience spans a range of areas, some of which include business transformation, culture change, talent management, leadership development, structural redesign and team effectiveness. So I might welcome you guys to the conversation. Welcome Justine and Dylan.
Thanks, Nick. Thank you, Nick. Thanks, Nick, but thanks everyone for being online or on this webinar today. I guess, as we're sort of reflecting on the attendance at this, and we actually held a similar session to the one we're going to run today last week, that there's been a real spike in interest in this particular topic, and we're reflecting, I guess, on why that might have been or why that is. I guess the things that were on our mind potentially as those reasons were, I guess, just the sharp performance context that we find ourselves in at the moment. From a market perspective, it's a pretty dynamic market out there. There's a lot happening. There's ebbs and flows from a performance perspective, and that has some real implications that we're seeing, which is that business leaders are using the culture word quite a lot in a performance context. So we're sure that may be one of the reasons that you might have tuned in today. We also see that there is potentially some confusion between the two constructs of culture and engagement as well. So to that end, that may be another reason why you've tuned in, and there could be many others as well. Hopefully we'll answer some of your questions, concerns and explore areas that are of interest to you today. I'd like now I'll just share the discussion structure that we're going to have today. So you see it up there on the screen. We'll just start by defining culture and engagement, and just at a high level sharing what do those two terms mean, are they the same or are they different, and why. Then we'll move into the linkages between culture and engagement and performance, and that word is a key word, performance. That was a word that we used in the title of this webinar, and we really want to explore what is the link between those two two constructs of culture, engagement and performance. Are they the same, different, and why? We'll then move into a bit more of a practical tone of conversation, which is what's the distinction between the two in terms of the change that they tend to drive. So how do you drive action out of these, and how are they different between performance and engagement? We'll talk about our key takeouts to sum up, and then we'll hopefully spend a good 20 minutes or so on questions with you. So yeah, it'd be great to hear those, and it's a fantastic forum to be in today. In a webinar, it's always better to do it up close and personal and face-to-face, and that would be a great opportunity post this that we would like to take up if anyone's keen to do that. At the same time, we'd just like you to get the most out of it by sharing any questions you have with us throughout today. An objective that we don't have through today that I would state up front is that we don't want to debunk any particular measure or approach to engagement or culture, but rather suggest that both are important. So that's an important thing to start up front. I think they're both important. We'll talk about why as we go through. But there is an assumption within the way we've framed today's discussion, and that is that that most organisations that we work with tend to spend quite a lot of time measuring engagement and much less time measuring culture. So to that end, we will spend more time today talking about why they're different and why you might want to get the balance right around those two constructs. So that is an assumption within our conversation today. And just to test that assumption as a way, now I'd like to do a little straw poll with you out there and get some data from you. And the question I'd like to ask you, and I think you can respond on the right-hand side of the screen as Nick talked about before, the question is essentially what type of data does your organisation collect regularly from an employee perspective? Is it employee engagement? Is it organisational culture data? Is it both? Because we know that's happening out there quite a lot, or none of the above. So it'd be great to just test that assumption. So I'll give you a couple of seconds to go through that now. When the data comes up, we'll play that back to you. Okay, in the meantime, while you're busily responding there, I'd like to maybe move into the first agenda item of our discussion, and that's really to define what is culture and what is engagement and how are they different at a high level. So you'll see from the next screen, if you just want to flick over there, Nick. So the next screen there, on the left-hand side, we've defined engagement there. And at a high level, engagement can be described as the individual or employee's reactions to the system. And when I say the system, I mean the organisation. So how are individuals reacting to the organisation, the workplace, and their role? The core of engagement questionnaires or surveys is about that, exactly. It's about individuals' reactions to the system, how they feel personally about the organisation. But there are other additions, as we've noted in that slide. So things like vision and values are often captured in engagement surveys. Satisfaction and commitment. Custom content, often there's a flavour of the year or the month or the strategic cycle that senior leaders want to collect data on, and sometimes that custom content shows up in engagement surveys. Rewards, leadership and strategy, best places to work, things like that. So key point there being that there are other additions to engagement surveys, and often it can be a number of different constructs in the data. Secondly, I'll talk about culture and what's different around that construct. So as opposed to being individual reactions to the system, culture is actually about the characteristics of the system. So it's about measuring how the organisation works and how people perceive the organisation to be working, not their own personal reaction to that. We have a model of culture that is up there on the screen now that's called the Denison model. It's a model of culture that we use, and I guess our alignment to that is based on the fact that it is a performance-oriented tool. So it was derived out of looking at organisations and how they best work, and really looking at what are the levers for performance from a culture perspective. So a very performance-oriented model, very based on research over 25 years. So I'm just going to walk you through the four areas of this model, and it's really just to help orientate you to the way that we are going to talk about culture today, because there are different ways that different individuals and employees perceive or talk about culture as a construct. So I'll start on the top right-hand side there around that mission area. And you can see from the slide there, it talks about things like strategic direction and intent, goals and objectives and vision. But broadly, it's about, do we know our direction? Is our purpose clear? Do we have a blueprint or a roadmap for success? And at a high level, do we know where we're going as an organisation? Moving anti-clockwise to the blue area around adaptability as a quadrant in this model. And it really looks at our responsiveness to the external market. So all organisations exist within a much broader environment. How are we listening to the marketplace? Are we responsive to customers? How do we learn as an organisation based on our own practices, but also on the external, reacting to the external market? And how are we able to create change to adapt to what is becoming a changing market that is, I guess, happening very rapidly and dynamically? If I keep moving around, the next area, the green area, is about involvement, and this is more typically measures things that relate to the construct of engagement. Typically in this area of culture, we were looking at empowerment of individuals, so the ability to make decisions close to the front line, ability to be involved in decision making and strategic planning, team orientation, how we work as teams, capability development, do we have the skills to execute on strategy. Broadly speaking, the outcome is, are our people aligned and engaged, and do they show commitment and ownership and responsibility to the organisation. The final area is consistency, and we often think about this as, does our organisation create leverage? Do we have enough consistency in the way we go about doing things, that we're not reinventing the wheel, that we have norms and practices and processes and systems that enable us to have a quality and repeatable approach to things that drives leverage through an organisation. Some of the things in here are, do we have core values that help us reach agreement and manage conflict, which can be really healthy, but can we get to outcomes as well? Coordination and integration, how do we work across boundaries and silos in complex organisations? Do we have enough commonality to be able to do that well? So I won't labour that model anymore just for the moment, but you can see it has a broad focus around the elements that drive performance of an organisation, and broadly speaking, that culture definition is about how do we describe the characteristics of an organisation. So with that, we did get the data in from you, so thank you for responding. So 28, so we had the four different types of responses, the first being employee engagement data only, organisational culture data, both or none. So we have 28% of you listening who are collecting employee engagement data, 6% who are collecting organisational culture data, 39% both, and 28% none. So I guess that does reinforce our assumption around the fact that not a lot of organisational culture data is necessarily being captured, although the both is a really interesting one. That's the highest one. Nearly 40% of you are citing that you're capturing both of those too. So I think that is something that we will delve into a little bit here around ensuring that you have clarity about what they are and how to use them well. So with that, I will hand over to Justine to talk in more depth about what engagement and culture are as constructs or measures, but how that links to performance. So thank you, Justine.
Yeah, thanks, Dylan. And just before I do that, we have had a couple of feedback posts on our chat room, so please feel free to use that feature of the webinar. While most of the feedback has been that the audio is quite good, Sarah, and I'm sorry to single you out, but I want you to know that we are addressing your concerns. We've noticed that there's a little bit of an audio issue for you at your end. So given the mixed feedback that generally the audio seems to be good, if you wouldn't mind just playing with some of your individual settings to see if that corrects it. But rest assured, we'll follow up with you individually after the webinar and make sure you receive a recording there. So I just wanted to do that care announcement, if you like, there. So moving on, as Dylan mentioned now, to explore some of the different or the main differences between engagement and performance so that we can further unpick or understand the implications of performance. And to kickstart this conversation, I'd like to discuss one of the major differences using a framework that I find is the easiest to understand these differences. And this is a simple framework first advocated by Edgar Schein, and if you've worked in the culture space for a little while, you may be familiar with his work because he's considered by many to be a culture guru, if not the culture guru. So Schein has really, I guess, championed us as OD practitioners to really listen, to really consider our work through 3 different lenses. And you can see the human pyramid here is our way of explaining these 3 different lenses. So the first lens or level of analysis that you can take is the individual level. So that's our little red stick figure on top of the human pyramid there. And the individual level of analysis really speaks to our one-on-one work with leaders. So for example, yesterday afternoon I was doing some leadership development planning with a single leader. So that's the individual level of analysis. The second level of analysis is really around our work with groups or teams. So your classic team effectiveness work is a good example here. And the third level of analysis is when we actually look at organisational wide initiatives, and culture change really sits within this level of analysis. So to summarise, the most basic difference between engagement and culture is the different levels of analysis that they do in fact operate at. And you can see here that engagement really sits or rests at that individual level of analysis, whereas culture, on the other hand, rests at that organisational wide. It's a system level or system lens that you take into your work. So that's an important key difference between the two. So in terms of exploring that difference a little further, if I take you through the next slide, you can start to see some of the implications of this different level of analysis. To start off with, engagement surveys often include items like I'm passionate about my work, I have the tools and resources I need to do my job. That might be a second example. And I am paraphrasing here from a variety of engagement surveys out on the market. But the giveaway in terms of that individual level of analysis is that the stem phrases of these questions often start with the word I. And it's because engagement is an individual construct. It really is focused on how individuals feel about themselves and their jobs, how they feel about their work and how they feel about the organisation. And because it's an individual level construct, it best predicts individual levels of performance. That kind of makes sense. It's sort of intuitive there. So the sorts of outcomes that individual level constructs or engagement surveys can predict are things like output, so how much I produce, quality, what's the quality of what I produce, discretionary effort, and that's a phrase you may or may not have heard, but it really talks to whether or not I go above and beyond in my role. An example I've heard someone use recently that's really stuck in my mind is, do I wash my own coffee cup, but do I wash the coffee cups of others as well when I see them in the sink? So that's an example of discretionary effort. And intention to stay, or my commitment to the organisation, might be another predictor of performance, or a correlation to performance that engagement surveys are useful in helping you to understand. On the other hand, culture is an organisational level construct, and so it predicts outcomes associated with organisational performance. So the things here that you're likely to see or be able to predict are profitability, growth, innovation, quality, customer satisfaction. And the difference between the items in a culture survey versus an engagement survey is that they typically contain items targeted at the system. So examples here could be our strategy leads other organisations to change the way they compete. Another example could be innovation and risk-taking are encouraged. So questions such as these, they're aimed at the system, and the giveaway here is that you should see a lot more we's instead of I's in the STEM phrases there. And they're really focused at the interactions between people, processes and organisational systems, rather than just individuals' responses to those. So what we've done here is we've looked at a pretty fundamental difference between engagement surveys and culture surveys, but I think it's important to now look at the relationship between the two, because we know that does exist. So if I move on now to the next slide, thanks Nick. Great. In terms of exploring the relationship between culture and engagement, we've had the benefit of leveraging a lot of the research that Denison, our culture partner, has been able to provide, and they have access to a global database of, it's almost numbering 1,000 organisations now, from a really broad range of industries and from almost, they said, almost every country in the world. And they've been able to produce composites of both the bottom and top 10 cultures. So you can see those composites on your screen there. And the quick reference guide, or the quick way to read these, is more colour is good. and we want more colour over all 4 quadrants there. So what these composites are able to tell us or show us is that the weaker the culture, so evidenced by less colour in the profile, the lower the engagement scores, and the healthier culture, the higher the engagement scores. So you can see there that the composite of the bottom 10 cultures overall, their engagement scores tend to sit at about the 11th percentile. So the vast majority, 89% of organisations who complete engagement scores will perform more strongly than the bottom 10 cultures there. On the other hand, you can see that that composite of the top 10 cultures, they're showing engagement scores up around the 83rd percentile, so quite a distinct difference. So clearly there's a relationship here, that this data is hard to deny. But the question still remains, in what direction, does engagement drive culture, or is it the other way around? So for any of those organisational psychs on the other end of the phone, or anyone who loves their stats, you'll understand that correlation doesn't actually equal causation. So we can't necessarily prove causation despite the strength of the relationship that appears apparent. But still, it's good to understand what that relationship might look like. So if we move to the next slide now, we can unpick this a little further. Now, I must admit, initially this slide can be a little difficult to orient to. There's arrows going in every which direction, but I'll walk you through those to explain them. But I guess if I was to provide a high-level summary of what this screen is suggesting, it's really, again, to refer back to the Denison's research, which has been built up over almost a quarter of a century now. So there's a really strong evidence base that sits behind it. And Denison's research shows that measures of the system, so measures of the organisation overall, are better predictors of business performance than measures of individuals' reactions to that system. So it's a bit of an echo of a theme that we're hearing throughout this presentation. And this prediction is particularly true over the long term. So in other words, while engagement and culture measures both tell us something important, you want to pay attention to both sets of data that you're receiving. Culture measures are better predictors of performance over time. So if I walk you through the diagram and the arrows here, we can understand that a little further. So you'll see a thick arrow from culture to engagement, but a thinner arrow from engagement back to culture. So this reflects the research findings that culture has a more immediate impact on engagement rather than the other way around. This means that yes, while thriving, happy employees will influence a culture over time, in the short term, engaged employees are best viewed as an outcome of a healthy culture rather than a driver. Also note that engagement has a direct impact on individual performance. You can see that straight arrow there. Whereas, but an indirect impact on business performance. So in this sense, individual performance acts as a mediator between engagement and business performance, whereas culture has a direct impact on both engagement and performance. So you can see those direct line of sight or direct arrows there. So what this tells us, or what this is really reinforcing to us at the moment, is that culture, in a way, can provide more bang for your buck. Because it has an impact. So improving culture can actually have a positive impact on both engagement and business performance. And we find that this is particularly true in today's business environment, where we're all being asked to do more with less. And I think also that this relationship highlights an assumption that I admit I held up until recently, that if you have a happy worker and that happy worker is a productive worker, when you add up all those happy productive workers, surely you have a high-performing organisation. That's sort of a truism or a common sense belief that I certainly held. But I think delving into this research helps us to understand that might be a little simplistic because measures, individual level measures, don't necessarily capture the interactions between people or with the organisational systems and processes that they need to interact with. So what we need is a full picture of performance. So in terms of the slide that you have on your screen now, I will talk to that because part of the reason you need a full performance picture is that while closely related, culture and engagement are mutually exclusive. So this means that it's actually possible for an organisation to have high engagement scores but also be facing serious business issues, whether this is, that silos are rife, there's strategy misalignment, distrust in senior management. And the way that you can understand this seemingly contradictory statement in terms of engagement could be high and other performance metrics might be low, is that you can see by the reference in the Denison model that different aspects of engagement or culture actually predict different performance outcomes. So you can see there that if growth is your key business driver and something that you're keen to improve or accelerate, you want to be focusing on things associated with the adaptability trait or the mission trait that you can see in the red and blue there. Where if it's more that your organisation is focused on stability of performance, profitability, things like return on investment or return on equity, you're going to be focused more on some of the levers associated with the mission and consistency traits. Whereas if it's more operating performance, quality and indeed employee satisfaction, which is linked quite closely to engagement, involvement, consistency, these are traits that have a strong internal focus that you would be focused on. And finally, if it was more things like innovation or customer satisfaction, and we know there's an established link between customer satisfaction and engagement, you'll be looking more at the external focus back out to the wider environment in terms of involvement and adaptability. So this slide is really about highlighting that culture and engagement as single constructs don't predict performance in its entirety, they predict different elements of performance. So it's good to get a complete performance picture. And I guess just before I hand back to Dylan, a couple of examples might help bring that to life a little bit more. The first example that I'd reference is some recent people strategy work that we helped a client with. Now, when we are involved in people strategy work, we have the benefit and the privilege to have access to a wide range of data from that organisation, or in this case it was a business unit's 3-year people strategy that we were working on. And because we had access to a whole host of performance metrics as well as engagement results, we're able to see something a little quirky emerge from one of the teams within this business unit, and this was a claims processing team, and they demonstrated extremely high engagement results. They had extraordinary team cohesion. There was great care that they demonstrated for one another, high levels of pride in their work. Many of these individuals in this team had been in their roles for long periods of time, and they certainly intended to stay in them, so that intention to stay metric was there. Interestingly, this team actually even physically sat away from the rest of the business unit, so it was sort of this engaged, happy ecosystem of its own. But when we looked at some of the performance data that lined up with these engagement results, it was clear that they were actually seen as slow and inefficient by the broader organisation, and there was actually a call to automate a lot of what they do. Typical feedback that we saw was that they were unresponsive to the needs of the broader organisation and somewhat unreceptive to new ways of working. So if we again refer to the Denison model that you have on your screen there, the team, while engaged, are likely to be low on the adaptability trait, and in particular things like customer focus and creating change. And there's implications of this both on internal customer satisfaction and their ability to innovate or think about their jobs and their roles differently. So I guess if that was a specific example in terms of a broader theme, if you like, that we see in many organisations, particularly at the moment where a lot of strategies are placing the customer at the centre, is the tension we see between product development teams and either your customer service or sales team, depending on what the actual organisation is. Now, as individuals and as teams, they can be highly engaged in their work, but what we're finding is that they often operate in silos that don't actually collaborate or talk with one another. And what this means is that they can fail to actively produce a joined-up approach in that they're not actively managing the customer product interface. And what you see here is things fall through the cracks and they end up squabbling and blaming one another for the customer issues. It's sort of pass the parcel or hot potato. So in addition to lacking sort of a true customer focus, if we go back to the Denison model, this common scenario in organisations is also likely to point to lower scores on things like the consistency trait, specifically agreement, which is around your ability to work together to solve problems and make decisions, and the coordination and integration index. So again, while engagement scores could have been high, you're probably seeing lower profitability, for example, potentially through more rework, which is squeezing margins. So that's an example there of how you can actually see a different performance picture and not the full performance picture if you're not measuring both engagement and culture. So with that, Dylan, I might hand back to you to discuss some of the practical implications of being able to actually get your hands on this full performance picture.
Yeah, thanks, Justine. So Justine has really, I guess, just described the level of analysis that culture and engagement operate at and the links to performance there, and some really good practical examples at the end related to that. What I'd like to do now, I guess, is just to discuss some of the typical actions or outcomes that you're likely to see out of engagement and culture data. And sometimes the way we like to talk about that is through the conversations you're likely to hear. So you'll see the slide that's just appeared on your screen, the water cooler conversation. It's often where all the hard work gets done in organisations, we know. But so I guess that sort of analogy, if you like, of the conversations that you're likely to hear is a good one, because for us, measuring culture and or engagement and or something else is important, but actually it's not really anywhere near as important as the outcomes of those, which is about action. What's the action that you're driving after that diagnostic in terms of creating positive organisational change? So conversations are the start of action. They're the start of people thinking about what they need to do or what they could do differently. So I might just narrate you around that slide to show you some of the differences in conversations that we see organisations, leaders, people having after engagement surveys or after culture surveys. So on the left-hand side, you'll see some example conversations from engagement surveys or post-engagement surveys. And I'll start down the bottom there. So a typical response or conversation might be, we need to provide better role clarity for our people and individuals in our team. You might hear a conversation like, we need to communicate more with our people, so we need to share more information with them more regularly. And we need to provide more training so that people have the skills to do their jobs. Or as leaders, I need to be more present as a leader with my people. They're telling me that they need more presence. Or even at a higher level, and we definitely hear this sometimes, that sort of exasperated, our engagement index has gone down 3 points. So that's something that we sometimes hear as well. Before commenting on that, I'll just go across to the right-hand side about some of the conversations that come out that we typically hear out of our work and the work we do with clients after organisational culture surveys. So the top one there is, we need to improve the way we set and monitor organisational performance. Or the next one, we need to improve the way key functions work together across our organisation to create, for example, a streamlined experience for our customer, as an example that Justine shared before. We need to improve the way we plan and the level at which decisions can be made, might be another conversation. Or we need to improve the way we collect and respond to customer feedback. So I guess it's certainly important to say that both of those types of conversations are important, but they are different. And I'd like to maybe just point out a few of those key differences. So from an engagement perspective, I think what we can see, and maybe what you can see yourself from reading some of those typical conversations, is that the actions and outcomes and conversations tend to be a little more tactical. And by tactical, I mean that the actions or responses are often focused at the team level. They might be at the function level, but they're often at the team level and sometimes at the individual level as well. So where action or conversation is being pointed can be at a push down in the organisation rather than up. And to that extent, often action is owned or driven by a line manager. So that ownership of that culture data can be seen to sort of rest there. Another Another characteristic of those conversations are that they don't always have strong business context to them. So probably the most stark example of that there is the conversation where your entire engagement score or engagement metric or diagnostic has been boiled down to a particular metric. Saying we've gone down 3 points or up 3 points. That's not a great conversation for change. But in a more granular way, maybe some of the things are, we need to improve our training or skills, do more from a training perspective. The question might be capability and what? What is the context of the organisation? What capabilities are the issue there? Is it about an individual, or is it how we're connecting this to the organisational strategy and what we're trying to improve at that level? Or communications about what? What things do people need to know more about that are more important? Generally, more communication is better, but there are definitely things that might be more poignant at particular times. Role clarity, might be another one. Role clarity to help resolve what issue. Is it an issue about process overlap or something else? So that context is really important within creating business change, and sometimes we don't see as much business context in engagement data. On the other hand, some of the culture data, as I said, there can be different conversations. They often play to organisational-wide interventions. So you can see the nature of those comments, the way key functions work together, the level at which decisions can be made. They're often at an organisational level. The value of that is that there is the possibility or the opportunity out of this sort of diagnostic for big impact at a strategic level. Similarly, I think you can see with the context that sometimes is provided through some of these conversations, you can see the multiple types of actions that might be driven out of this and how the context can really help. So, for example, we need to improve the way we collect and respond to customer feedback. You can imagine the different elements of that. You might be thinking about what are the processes by which we engage with customers to get data about the quality of our products or services. What's the capability of our people to engage in that conversation in the right way to get that data and create a relationship? And then what's our decision-making process with an organisation to take that data and do something useful with it that responds to the initial needs? So you can see the multiple actions that stem off that type of data point. They're very context-driven, and we often find leaders are very sensitive and interested in that sort of information because it connects to the things that really matter to them, which is performance and organisational outcomes. So that context really helps from a change perspective. I guess I would reiterate once again that both are good. Both of those conversations are good at the left-hand side, the outcomes or the actions that a leader can start to drive around their own team versus at an organisational level, but they are different. Similarly, a point that I would share, and maybe if you can flip to the next slide, Nick, is that because of the level of analysis that's being done, engagement being more at an individual level and culture at an organisational level, we often see ownership of data rest at different levels in an organisation, and that does have different implications. So as that slide shows on the left-hand side, because of the quite clear connection between manager relationship and engagement of their people and employee engagement outcomes, often engagement data is driven down. So you can see accountability for that being pushed down in the organisation to the front line and to individual managers to respond to in that sort of potentially more tactical way at times, as we shared before. Because many of the actions that come out of that data being pushed down are people related rather than necessarily having the breadth of an organisational response to them, they're often pushed across as well to HR, and in some less great examples you see HR actually owning the data and feeling quite tense when engagement data has gone down because they're feeling quite accountable for it, and that's obviously not the situation we would like to be in an ideal world around creating change. We obviously want managers to be owning that as much as possible. The opposite happens a little bit from a culture data perspective. So the systemic focus, the clear connection and narrative it has to performance, and the fact that mostly our organisations we work with, organisational leaders, their antenna is up around performance data, and it's up around things that they know can impact organisational outcomes really clearly in their mind. So often we will see culture data be pushed up in the organisation, even to the point that it can become quite a strategic discussion, which is not to say that engagement data doesn't ever play out in that forum. We know that it does, and we're sure it does, but we do see culture data getting to that level quite regularly. We're working with an organisation at the moment who are going through a significant transformation where they've, refined their operating model and also restructured their whole organisation based on a new strategy that they'll roll out over the next 5 years. And for them, aligning culture to that new shift, strategic shift as an organisation was really important. And in using this data, they're actually using it as a roadmap to execution. So it's actually become a key guide and marking post around their execution, and it's showing them the way. So it's certainly got a seat at the table as a conversation point, which is critical in getting the resources needed to drive change. Okay, so with that, I might hand back to Justine to talk briefly about some of the implications around just driving action in organisations from this sort of work.
Thanks, Dylan. I thought that was a nice segue as I heard you referring to creating change there. Before I do that, though, I might just ask for some action on your part. If there's any questions on your mind, any burning issues you'd like to see this conversation morph into once Dylan and I wrap up, please feel free to pop those in the chat section of your screen there. We'll take those and we'll have them ready to go in the time that we have left. So just a request there before we get into the last little section here that really is we wanted to make sure that we left you with some key pointers around creating leverage within the system and creating change. So that's what I'll move to now. So I talked earlier about some of the key differences between engagement and culture, and I think one of the differences that we do sometimes see play out is the extent to which the two different measures provide a roadmap for change. Now, I'll apologise in advance if this is a little cheesy, but a metaphor that I like to use to explain this difference goes something like this. So engagement can be seen as similar to measuring your blood pressure. It's good to measure it, because if it's high or you get a reading you weren't expecting, you can do something about it. So that's key. However, unless you're a medical professional or you've been on Google Doctor and sort of typed your question in, it's not obvious simply from the act of measuring it what you should do to correct it. And we feel that, on the other hand, surveying culture is like measuring the behaviours that led to high blood pressure in the first place, which means it's more instructive about the actions you need to take to lower it. So, for example, if your diagnostic shows that you're not doing enough exercise, and we know there's a link between exercise and high blood pressure, you can commit to walking to work a couple of times a week to lower it. So it's more instructive in terms of the actions or the next steps once you've measured it, that we find is really important. A second consideration when it comes to action planning is that focusing on the individual level of analysis, which some, not all, but some engagement surveys tend to do, is that they say little about how the organisation works overall. So if we take a representative engagement survey item, and I'm paraphrasing again here, but something like, I enjoy coming to work every day, while answers to this question are good to know, how does a busy leader, a team or a business unit create an action plan for making an individual employee happy to come to work? Given that there are so many individual factors that can influence this, you often end up with tactical, almost laundry lists of activities. And many of these are one-offs that are hard to connect back to business strategy, as Dylan suggested. And this can make it really difficult to get buy-in from your senior stakeholders, and that was a point that Dylan has just made. But also difficult to secure funding. We know how hard it is at the moment to get the funds to secure important initiatives. Also to achieve scale, so scale your initiatives up, and ultimately to create sustainable change. So as Dan Denison likes to say, and he often has a few pearlers that we like to refer to, if you focus only on engagement, it can be difficult to know where to insert the crowbar in order to create leverage. So that sounds a little aggressive, but it's really, in terms of the language, but it's really about highlighting that sometimes from engagement surveys, it can be difficult to know what business levers to pull in order to achieve the outcomes that you're looking for at the system overall. However, if you add culture to the mix, so that the main point that we've been advocating for throughout this webinar is that both are important. So if you add culture to the mix, you now have a broader framework of high performance that helps to tell a story about how the organisation works and how it can become high performing. And we're finding from our work that this story is really key, that people are really looking for a narrative that helps knit a lot of strategic initiatives together, a lot of people initiatives back to the overall what the business is trying to achieve. So we find that the combination of engagement and culture data really helps to tell that story. More loudly, I guess, is a way to explain it there. So culture data helps you to know what matters, but importantly, if we refer back to the slide on your screen there, it can tell you or give you a sense of what matters most given your particular context, your particular industry and the outcomes you're specifically looking to achieve. So depending on what performance metrics you're looking to improve, it will give you a sense when you get your culture data back where you might want to focus your attention first, because we know that we can't do everything at once. So by looking at this data, you have a sense of being able to prioritise and sequence the actions that you'll take as a result of receiving the data. And then you can actually link this data back to your strategy and implement actions that are important to that overall blueprint, not implement a shopping list of sort of nice-to-haves. I think the key point to call out here is that it's really important to remember that there are many factors that influence culture. The Denison's research has pulled out 12 that have been shown over time and through significant research that impact the cultural factors that impact performance the most. So while there are many factors that influence culture, not all cultural factors influence performance. So it's really handy as us as OD practitioners, as HR professionals, to be able to take the guesswork out for our leaders and our organisations. So that's the sort of overall point I'd like to leave you with in terms of creating leverage in the system. So I think just before we move to questions, should we do the wrap-up?
Yeah,
Key takeaways?
I will. I'll wrap up really quickly because there's quite a few questions coming in and we'd probably like to spend as much time in that space as possible. So our key takeouts are there, and this might be just sort of as 60 seconds for you to think of any other questions you might like to throw onto the pile. The first point there is that culture measures the system, employee engagement measures individual reactions to the system. So there is a difference between those two constructs, and research over 25 years makes it clear that culture drives organisational performance. There's a strong link there, and it drives or increases engagement. Employee engagement is an outcome measure and is more linked to individual performance. So they are three of the early points that we made, and related to that bubble on the right, it's saying they're not the same constructs. They're both valuable, however. Culture data, because of its systemic focus on performance drivers, is often used to instigate org-wide strategic initiatives, and we talked about some of the benefits that has before in connecting to leaders and their agenda. And this elevates the level at which culture data is often owned and acted upon at. Conversely, engagement data, because of its focus on the individual, is often actioned or owned more tactically at the line manager level. So engagement and culture often have different owners and actions coming out of their use as data sets. Finally, as culture data focuses on drivers of org performance, survey outcomes tend to be more easily contexted in reference to business strategy. This helps prioritisation of action and investment. I think Justine's crowbar example is a really good one. It's saying how do you use any data, engagement or performance, to help leaders see the connection between it, organisational practices, including people practices, and org performance. We think that that's a critical point as to how do you create a performance story to enable action and to enable the commitment of leaders post any diagnostic. That's really the outcome that we're trying to get to. So they're probably the main 5 or 6 points that we've made in the last 40 minutes or so. But we'd like to move on to questions now. We've got a number, and I think I'll answer the first one that I think came from Andrew. So thanks.
Yeah, I might jump in there, Dylan. We've had some fantastic questions coming through from our audience, so thank you so much for taking part in our conversation today. Our first question, as Dylan said, comes through from Andrew in Singapore, one of our Singapore participants. He asks, and I'll direct it back to you, Dylan. Could you talk more about the dynamic tensions within, that's really called out within the Denison model, in particular mission and involvement, as well as adaptability and consistency?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Terrific question. I might get you to flip back to, I think, slide 13, Nick. It's a really good question, and essentially that slide, I guess, might help me articulate this. Broadly speaking, the research that sits behind this model is really robust, and I guess the point that Justine pointed out before is that more colour on all of these areas is good in terms of organisational performance. So more adaptability, more clarity of mission, more involvement, more consistency. So the more the better. But the reality is there are areas of each of the model that relate to different performance or outcome metrics in organisations more strongly. So, for example, you can see on the left-hand side, innovation and customer satisfaction metrics related to that. Organisational performance metrics are much more related to some of the practices on the left-hand side. So, you can imagine an organisation with a strong customer focus, with a strong ability to create change and learn from the past. They're in a great position to be able to listen to their customers, think about new product development, for example, and to innovate based on that, looking at the market, looking at their customers and looking at what to do from that. So you can see that would be much closely linked to some of those metrics. Similarly, you can see how the mission area, an organisation with a very clear strategic direction, intent, and goals and objectives that are linked to that really clearly and that are measured well and monitored over time, has a strong link to growth, for example, and you can imagine an organisation with a strong sales culture would be really strong in those areas. Your question really pertains to the dynamic tensions that exist between those, and that is definitely the case. I think a good one might be looking at adaptability and consistency, for example. So on one hand, you're asking an organisation and its people and its practices to be adaptive to the external environment, to be able to listen to customers, to be able to learn from its mistakes and change, whereas on the other side, you're asking for the organisation to have stability and consistency over time. I guess the way we often talk about this is that organisations that are effective over time will have an and conversation, and the and conversation is you need to be adaptable. You need, every organisation has customers in one shape or another, but every organisation also needs to create stability over the time. So it's an and conversation. It's adaptability and consistency. In saying that, there are often priorities for organisations, and that means that they create change over a period of often not months but years, and it might be that based on their current strategic context and position, their current data around adaptability, for example, it might mean that the next year or two of their organisation might be focused much more on customer and adaptability, and that they might then choose to focus on getting consistency through those practices they're instigating to gather data from customers to create change over time. So you can't do everything at once is probably my message there, and there are tensions between the two. The model of the Denison model is based on the competing values model, which essentially says that there are competing demands in an organisation. But I'd finish by saying that organisations over time that outperform others are able to recognise those competing demands and manage them simultaneously through a period of planned change.
And I'd probably add, Dylan, there that we actually find in our leadership development space we're spending a lot of time helping leaders unpack that and conversation, or to understand the concept of paradox, that you can actually have two right answers at the same time. And we find that particularly with technical organisations, or where managers have sort of worked their way up from technical specialist roles where they're used to having right answers, they're used to having an expert in the room, they're dealing with the ambiguity and uncertainty and the tension that those dynamic paradox or that paradox creates. It's quite revolutionary for some of them to understand that concept, and we find just that kind of mindset, how do you manage paradox, is really useful in your change efforts.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think the point there is that if you can surface those tensions or challenges, then you can manage them, but often they go unsurfaced or undiagnosed or spoken about clearly. Another question here.
Yeah, okay, so this one came through from Isabel. Thanks very much, Isabel. Her question was, what are some culture diagnostic tools you would recommend or rate? Dylan, Justine, who?
They can answer it almost together.
We can answer that fairly simply. We won't extend too much. The framework and the diagnostic that we've shared with you today, the Denison framework, we about 5 years ago or 6 years ago, upon starting this practice, went on a global search to look for a culture tool that had strong links to performance. So validated over time the links to performance outcomes that we know business leaders care about, that enables you to create change on the back of any diagnostic work. That was where we ran across the Denison framework and diagnostic, and we're really strong advocates of it as a performance culture diagnostic. So that would be probably a simple answer to that question. We really rate that particular framework and we use it extensively.
Great. Thank you, Dylan. Our next question is from Sarah. Sarah, thank you for being patient with your sound issues and thanks for sending in the question. It's how do you get the right mix between engagement and culture? I.e., is it a bit of an 80-20 rule or how do you guys like to pose that for organisations?
Yeah, I think that's probably a nice hypothesis that 80-20 could be the right mix there. I think some of the things that come to mind is obviously you don't want to survey people to death, so I think any way that you can gather through the same tool or sort of a concise set of questions, gather that data, that's important. Obviously you don't want people to sort of have to do a sort of lengthy 100 items culture survey and then a similar thing. And similarly, because people might not always be perceiving the distinctions between the two as obviously as HR professionals, if you sort of were to do one survey and then a month or two later another one, it's in some ways people aren't going to understand that different level of analysis. So I think that is how do you get the right mix. Yeah, I think 80-20 is a nice sort of starting point. And I think it depends on things like the maturity of your organisation, some of the challenges and issues that you're trying to address. But I think a balance is good and that's potentially the right way to go. As an example, and we're not trying to do a product push here at all, but the Denison does actually have an engagement module. So if you are looking to sort of do it through the one provider, which I think is good for efficiency, and if you want to do it through the one survey, you can do a culture survey but tack on the engagement module if you wanted specific sort of insight around that. But that's one example. So I just think about the provider that you might look into, whether they can do both for you, whether it's possible to do it through the same platform and same survey. That would be some of the things that come to my mind. Did that, Dylan?
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question, guys. We might go to this one. This one came through from Mark. He says that one of the challenges for line managers is helping employees move beyond individual engagement, so what's in it for me, to help them see that they are part of something bigger. They're part of a culture. Their contribution matters. Do you have any tools or tips for how you enable this?
Thanks, Mark. That's a good question and not one that's easy to answer quickly. But I think the first point I would reinforce there is one that Justine made before, and it's a little more academic than I suspect that you would be potentially looking for, and that is that by focusing on culture and creating an effective organisation, that in itself will impact engagement. So people working in a place that is doing good things and great things with customers, that has processes and working relationships across functions that make sense and see an outcome, that work will create a really positive uplift. People want to be involved in something that's creating impact for the organisation, and the results that are driven from that from a functional and organisational perspective are something that individuals, we know through the data, individuals get engagement out of. They get engagement out of being, as you say, being in part of something bigger and seeing the impact of their work achieved at an organisational and also at a societal level, I suppose, as well. I guess very practically, some of the work that we often do with leaders around this is how they get really clear on their narrative around how they're talking about an organisation, what their function contributes to the organisation, what the organisation contributes to the external environment. And that is sometimes, I guess it sounds like a simple thing, but it's sometimes not always a conversation leaders are practiced in or rehearsed in or spend enough time talking to their people about. So talking about where's the organisation going, what's the strategy around that, how will that impact our customers and stakeholders, and what's the impact of the function on that in terms of the good work that we do, and then of course leading that down to the individual. But I guess in some ways maybe this might be, a little bit of an interesting comment, but maybe not spending as much time trying to sell what's in it for me, but actually talking about the larger construct, getting more balance around that conversation might be an interesting concept. We definitely find that leaders are maybe a bit biased or skewed at some point at the moment, feeling a real heavy burden to actually continually share that with individuals about the WIFM principle, the what's in it for me, and maybe just shifting the bias across to the other end might be important. So that's, I guess, maybe a quick answer to that one.
Okay, well thank you very much. Unfortunately that's all that we have time for today. Thank you very much for joining us in our discussion. For those of you whose questions that we were unable to get to, we apologise. We've got some information up on the screen. Please contact us directly and we'll endeavour to contact you. I'd also just like to remind you that we'll send you out a link to the recording of today's webinar as well that you can send on to your teams or other colleagues as well who you think might be interested. Also just a reminder, to make sure that you don't miss out on our upcoming webinars as well, please follow us on LinkedIn and our Twitter page. We're always advertising when we're doing those different webinars or I guess publishing some of our thought leadership as well. But once again, thank you very much, and we look forward to having another conversation with you soon.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for attending, folks. Thanks very much.